Stories are powerful, and everyone has a story. Welcome to the Convocations program at Carleton College. I'm your host, Roth, Director of Events. We'll be together for 1 hour, and we'll include time for questions. You may click on that Q&A tab on your screen to submit your questions at any time, and I will pose them to our guest speaker at the conclusion of her presentation. Dr. Shira Nayman, who, by the way, is parent of Carleton Jr. Lucas Sass, was born in South Africa and grew up in Australia, where she was raised in a community of mostly Holocaust survivors. She has lived in Israel, Mexico, France, and Colombia, and now makes her home in New York. She started out as a clinical psychologist, using storytelling in psychotherapy, and then became a strategic marketing consultant for iconic American brands and political candidates. All the while, she was publishing essays, short stories, and novels that explore the richness of human experience. She believes that meaningful stories are grounded in deep human truth and their intersection with the ever-evolving, unfolding cultures in which we live. One theme running through her work concerns how socio-historic trauma, specifically involving World War II, can weave into the self and also cast long shadows on down through the generations. She takes up this theme in her talk, Dark Urgings of the Blood, Storytelling and the Transgenerational Transmission of Trauma. Welcome to Carleton College, Dr. Nayman.
Well, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I want you to know I do have my Carleton hat, and at some point in the middle of the talk, if I get the feeling that I need it, I will put it on. Wish I was there with you in person in beautiful Northfield. I've had the good fortune to visit there a couple of times. Absolutely love it. It's a stunning campus and a stunning college, and I'm very proud to be a Carleton mother. And today I'm going to be talking to you, as Kerry mentioned to you, about what people talk about as the transgenerational transmission of trauma. Now, I will explain the title in a minute, where the dark urgings of the blood comes from. But just to begin with, I wanted to say a few things about what is meant by that, by the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And there are many scholars who've written on this subject. Basically, it's the idea that trauma can be passed on down through the generations. There's a key researcher in the area named Dominic LeCapra, and I'm just going to read his definition because he really puts a fine point on it in a way that I think is helpful. Intergenerational transmission of trauma refers to the way that those not directly living through an event may nonetheless experience and manifest its post-traumatic symptoms, something especially prominent in the children or intimates of survivors who are possessed by the past and tend to relive what others have lived. Now, sometimes these offspring, children directly of people who've been through extreme trauma, suffer from flashbacks to the events experienced by their ancestors. There's another researcher named Rosenthal. I just want to mention what she says. A quote again: descendants of survivors often become afraid in situations which they associate, often unconsciously, with a persecution in their relatives' pasts. In many cases, these people imagine themselves as inmates of concentration camps or as being exterminated along with their relatives. So there's a lot of work that's been done in psychology and psychiatry around this subject. One of the key groups studied, of course, has been offspring, grown children of Holocaust survivors and their children, just because there was this, strange, large case study of thousands of people who were survivors and who presented with certain symptoms, and their children and grandchildren were presenting with symptoms too. So it provided an area of study. But there's other work that's been done less extensively, but regarding other traumatic, socio-historical traumatic events, such as the genocides in Rwanda, Nigeria, Cambodia, Armenia. Sadly, there are many of these sorts of terrible historical traumas, also the former Yugoslavia. And some of the symptoms that people have seen in these offspring of survivors, I'll just list a couple just to give you a context: depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, certain behavioral disorders. Now, I'm talking about them being evident psychiatrically and psychologically in the offspring of the survivors, not only necessarily the survivors themselves. And a wide range of symptoms have been reported to have been transmitted over the generations. I'm just going to give you this little list because I think, again, it sort of evokes a little bit of the psychological territory, because it's not necessarily extreme psychiatric illness, but perhaps lesser, but still things that can be very difficult to experience and disruptive of life. Distrust of the world, impaired parental function, chronic sorrow, which is a very moving sort of term to me, chronic sorrow, inability to communicate feelings, an ever-present fear of danger, pressure for educational achievement, interestingly, sort of a super obsessive pressure for educational achievement, separation anxiety, lack of entitlement, unclear boundaries, and overprotectiveness. Now, I do want to point out that there are also studies that suggest that not only traumatic experience, but also resilience patterns can be transmitted down through the generations and developed by future generations of traumatized people. And I think it's important to keep our focus on and awareness on that as well, that resilience can also be very characteristic of offspring and generations down of peoples who've been subjected to these kinds of socio-historical trauma. Now, I personally grew up, as Kerry pointed out, in a close-knit community, Jewish community in Australia that was made up almost exclusively of Holocaust survivors. My own family were not directly affected by the Holocaust. I did have uncles and aunts and great aunts and uncles and cousins who were exterminated during the Holocaust. My immediate family, however, came from South Africa. So in that sense, we were different from all my other friends and the people that I grew up with. And you know, I think that clearly had an impact on my writing since the books. I've written 4 books, and all of them touch in some way on this subject, as well as essays that I've written that do. So I think I was more an observer of what was going on in the homes of my friends, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I just wanted to give you that context. So I've now described briefly what I mean by the transgenerational transmission of trauma. Now I want to talk a little bit about where narrative or storytelling would come in regarding this whole domain of transmission of trauma through the generations. I mean, some of this is common sense. We're all brought up with stories, right? Culture is conveyed through stories. Religion is conveyed through stories. Pretty much all of human endeavor, including science and all kinds of research, involves the development of narratives. Even just the forming of a hypothesis is a narrative endeavor. So our lives are clearly imbued with narrative. Our cultures are, we pass our histories and cultures to the next generation through storytelling. We also actually experience our own lives through storytelling. Just think about all of you now in college, and you're constructing your own narrative. The closer you get to the end of your 4 years, I hope you're thinking about the future. And so you're projecting your narrative forward as you make decisions. But there's another piece of it too. We also use narrative in talking about processing, giving voice to, witnessing, testifying about history, the history of our peoples, the history of our communities, the histories of our own selves. So narrative kind of partially forms us, but it also, we use narrative as a way of processing and experiencing the world. Just 2 slightly different angles. Oops, sorry, I know I have to just tell those people to stop making a noise. I'm getting pings. Forgive me. Sorry. Okay, never mind. I just hope they won't do that again. So I wanted to just say a word about the title that I chose, Dark Urgings of the Blood. Now, that is actually a quote taken from Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a German Jewish thinker, philosopher, quite assimilated. In fact, he married a Catholic woman. He was born in the late 1800s, died in 1965. And he talked about his own sort of self-examination of his own experience, that he felt there was some sense of dark urgings within his own blood, having to do with the history of the Jewish peoples. And I wanted to read you a little quote from another German writer from the 1800s, actually 18th century into the 18th century, Heinrich Heine. And this is a quote from his very famous poem, De Lorelei, which has a long history I won't have time to go into, but I just want to read these few lines, which I actually use as the little quote at the beginning of this book that I'm going to read from in a minute, one of my books. I do not know what haunts me, this sad and nameless pain, perhaps an ancient brooding tale coursing through my veins. So also referring to something that is sort of inchoate sense of brooding or trauma or something that is historically based, but yet that he felt and was articulating as running through his own veins, as if history, well, one could say history courses through our blood. I mean, certainly the history of the DNA and of the past generations is coursing through our blood, and perhaps also what those lives carried in the course of their existence. So I find this kind of also a kind of rich and moving notion that we're carrying these things within us, not always knowing, but feeling hankerings that may be related to a past that we're not even fully aware of. So I wanted to, I'm going to just frame the next chunk, or most of the talk actually, by pointing to two ways in which narrative could be seen as relevant to the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I've already touched on them, but I just want to get a little more explicit about it. The first is the ways in which narrative is actually a factor in the intergenerational transmission of the trauma, both the stories that are told to people growing up, but also the stories that are not told. And there can be a way in which heavy silence about traumatic events, things that are not expressed to family members as they're growing up, can also turn into stories. It can also turn those hidden stories into ghosts that end up haunting in a way. So I'm going to read you a quote from an adult child of a Holocaust survivor from Brazil. There was a big study done on Brazilian Holocaust survivors and their children. And it was a ethnographic study where a lot of people were interviewed and their stories were tabulated and brought together. Qualitative research is what they call it, as you probably know, some of you would know. And this is a quote from one of the adult children of the Brazilian Holocaust survivors. In other words, they were Holocaust survivors who ended up in Brazil. Quote, "My parents don't build any theories and they have nothing to tell because they don't want to remember. They're afraid of remembering, they're ashamed of remembering, because each and every one of their memories comes wrapped in this shame of having been who they were or having lived what they lived." So that was an example of sort of absence that ends up creating this a kind of a whole, HOLE, that is also sort of passed down and not knowing. Now, the second way in which narrative can be a factor in the transgenerational transmission of trauma is actually in dealing with the trauma. Narrative can play a role in facing historical trauma, in helping process and come to terms with it, giving it voice, bearing witness, creating awareness, impacting efforts towards meaningful societal change. We see this powerfully at work in our culture today. Stories are being reclaimed, you know, even the very movements that are dominating our society today. For example, starting with Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, there's a tremendous reckoning with tremendous bias in our society going far back that very centrally involves storytelling, reclaiming stories, telling stories, giving voice to stories that have perhaps been suppressed or sidestepped. I did a little brainstorm with myself just to sort of see, and just to see where I would go with how does narrative play in our lives in dealing with the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I just came up with this list, and you could probably come up with your own. I'm just going to read some of them because it's just, once you put your mind to it, it's so vast. Witness, testimony, chronicle, catharsis, revenge, processing, growth, agency, understanding, insight, wisdom, celebrate, commemorate. I'm doing this fast to get through it. Remember, forget, make sense of chaos, harness energy, tame, come to terms with, find closure, agitate, protest, revolution, community building, togetherness, finding companionship, connecting, opening up, closing down, inviting response, conversation and dialogue, monologue and speechifying. That was just a 5-minute brainstorm. I'm sure we could come up with another 60 notions. So you start seeing that, you know, narrative is really very powerfully present in our lives in ways small and large. Now, I want to say something on a personal note, that I only really came to understand how these themes of the transgenerational transmission and trauma and narrative and the role narrative plays was sort of wind through my own work when interviewers or reviewers were pointed out to me. I was just a writer writing my stories, and little did I know that apparently I was manifesting all these theoretical points having to do with this subject. I really had no idea. I did not set out to do this. And I guess that goes back to the idea of the sad and nameless pain coursing through one's veins, as Heinrich kind of put it, or the dark urgings of the blood. Somehow I had imbibed all these stories and all this historical knowledge, and I ended up as a writer articulating it again, not even conscious that I was doing it. And this was brought very much home to me when a woman wrote to me from Belgium, of all places. She happened to have written a dissertation about 2 of my books as part of her doctoral thesis. It was pretty unnerving for me to, well, I didn't actually read it at the time. I just read it recently in preparation for this talk. Her name is Lisa DeMay. And the title of the talk was The Representation of Trauma in Shira Nayman's Awake in the Dark and the Listener. So again, a little weird and unnerving to sort of see that. I was like, I just wrote a couple of books and apparently they have all these themes in them. Well, I sort of knew a little bit about it. But I went back to read, I actually read it in preparation for this talk, and she had some really interesting things to say about the theory associated with this subject. And I'm just going to walk you through a few of the points before I will read a couple of excerpts from my own work to show how it brings maybe some of this to light. But once she mapped it out, it was very intriguing to me. And I became aware too of how obviously this affects many people's, and I'm particularly interested in, what's going on, as we all are, I'm sure, in this country today, regarding reckoning with race and our history. And a lot of my work is actually involved in that area. And I'm just aware of the tremendous parallels, really. So I'm going to draw from her theoretical discussion about narrative in this context. But first, I'm just going to read you an excerpt from this book that I showed you before. And I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm just going to read it because I think it brings to light some of the theory that I'll then touch on afterwards. So this is from this book, Awake in the Dark. The first section is a long short story. It's called The House on Kronstrasse. I'm going to read the opening. It starts, there's a title that says Christian, that's the name of the narrator, New York City, 1985. That just situates you where this takes place. In this memory, which has haunted me the whole of my life, I am perhaps 2.5 years old and dressed in a special dress made of maroon velvet and lace. I am playing in a fountain that is ornate and dry. The dryness is a striking fact, for until this moment of recollection, I know it only as a fountain that furiously spurts. I am accustomed to leaping away from its spray. I have virtually no memories of my early years, aside from this one, which I attribute to the fact of a wartime childhood. In the memory, I'm filled with a distinctive mood I've not known since, and which I can only describe as a feeling of luxury, not of a trivial material kind, but in the fullness of the word's meaning, safety and ease, the promise of endless comfort, the implicit guarantee that all is right with the world and always will be. My mother is nearby. I can sense her if I do not see her. Then the moment blurs and time skips long minutes, perhaps even hours. The sun has moved. It is now overhead and hot on the crown of my head. I look down to see that my dress is crumpled, its hem soiled. I see my mother crouched over the steps leading up to our grand home. She seems busy with something, though I cannot make out what. At that moment she turns, she smiles. I am momentarily puzzled. I do not know why I am puzzled. That puzzlement has marked my relations with my kind soul of a mother for as long as I can remember. It is something I learned early on to try to hide from her. Only when I became a woman myself did I realize that my efforts had been unsuccessful, that my mother was all too aware of the odd distance between us. This distance came from me, I feel certain, and has been a great sorrow for my mother, with all the losses she has suffered, and me, her only child. I glance over to where my mother now lies. Her body is so reduced by illness that she's almost invisible among the bedclothes. I recoil from the rattle of her breath. I grit my teeth against my own selfishness and struggle to find something to say, though my mother no longer seems conscious. But they say the dying can hear, whether they appear to or not. I approach the bed, lower myself beside her, and rest my head on the pillow next to hers. Her eyes are closed. Her face looks unfamiliar. The deep lines I'm used to seeing are oddly smoothed away, as if she were undergoing a rapid undoing of years. I gaze into her softened features, imagining that this is how she gazed into my sleeping face when I was an infant. I struggle to imagine how she felt in just such a moment, but cannot catch on to it. I reach up to stroke her face. Her eyes snap open, alert in a way I've not seen in months. I failed you, she says, her voice almost robust. This comes as a shock because my mother has not spoken in weeks. Hilda, whatever are you saying? I reply. I have called my mother by her first name since I was a teenager, just one of the many little oddities in our relations. Her eyes are clouded with distress. She touches my face. Christian, my Christian, she says, her eyes leaking tears that settle in the creases of her cheeks, which seem to have reappeared with her alertness. You've been a good daughter. I know how hard you've tried. Something clutches in my chest. I know I've not been much of a daughter to her. I feel I've not been a daughter at all. I try to stifle the rising sob without much success. Shh, my mother says, batting at the tears that are now slipping down my cheeks. It's not your fault. You see, I took it all away. A terrible confusion takes hold of me. I feel as if a gauzy black curtain were being pulled around me. Hilda, what are you talking about? What is it you're trying to say? Her arm drops, she closes her eyes. Again, that odd dissolving of the heavy creases in her face. The house on Kronenstrasse, you know the number 58. I want to grab her, to shake her, to shriek at my mother. What? What did you take? What is not my fault? But I say nothing. I just lie there, the tears now flooding my eyes, looking into the smooth face that is no longer the face of my mother, that is now only a mask. So this is the death of her mother. This is the scene. And the mother, who had a heavy German accent, I was not going to imitate. I should mention that. She says something on her deathbed. She mentions a house on Kronenstrasse. And the daughter ends up going back to Heidelberg to find the house. And what she does really is it's a self-discovery journey. She finds out the origins of her past. It's not what she thought. She's not the woman's, well, I don't want to say in case anyone wants to read it, but it is a quest. It's a kind of a quest. And she's looking to uncover the hidden secrets that were connected with her own identity issues, not knowing who she is. You note, I said at the beginning, she never had felt fully alive, except in that memory from before when she was 2.5. Something shut down. And so the idea, I think, that the woman in her dissertation sort of pointed out was there's a way in which this quest journey to uncover the secret past is one of the ways in which, you know, the recovered narrative will help this woman recover her sense of fullness of being and will allow her to go on and live a more grounded life in touch with who she is and where she comes from. Now, I'd like to bring in another literary voice, that of Toni Morrison. I'm sure a lot of you have read her incredible work, and her many works often reflect the transgenerational transmission of trauma relating to the socio-cultural, historical, psychological trauma of slavery. And I'm going to just read the opening of Beloved, which is my personal favorite of her books. And then I'll talk about the relevance. She refers to, if any of you have read it, 124 is the name of the house. It's number 124. 124, the house, that's the house. 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way. But by 1873, Seth and her daughter Denver were its only victims. Now, Toni Morrison's introduction to her book, in her introduction, it's very illuminating, really. She touches on her own inspiration and really her own narrative means of taking on trying to bring to life the, excuse me, the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I want to read from that introduction. The terrain, slavery, was formidable and pathless. To invite readers and myself into the repellent landscape, hidden but not completely, deliberately buried but not forgotten, was to pitch a tent in a cemetery inhabited by highly vocal ghosts. In trying to make the slave experience intimate, I hoped the sense of things being both under control and out of control would be persuasive throughout, that the order and quietude of everyday life would be violently disrupted by the chaos of the needy dead, that the Herculean effort to forget would be threatened by memory desperate to stay alive. To render enslavement as a personal experience, language must get out of the way. Now, interestingly, there's a little paradoxical move there, because obviously she's rendering all of this in language, but she's also saying there's a way in which she's trying to get directly at experience. And in order to do this, I guess, having used language, she's got to push language out of the way. That would be a subject for another whole talk, but it's food for thought, and I'll leave it there. But I also want to bring in the voice of a contemporary writer. She happens to be a friend of mine. Her name's Dionne Ford. She's edited a very important book on slavery, and she's now writing her own. It's a kind of a memoir, but it's this kind of transgenerational transmission of trauma memoir, really. And it's almost finished. It's not finished yet. But this is her description of the book, which I found. I asked her to send me a description, and this is how she describes it. In a cemetery in the Mississippi Bayou, my ancestors are laid to rest, the white one atop a hill, overlooking the black ones that he owned. When my daughter at 5 decided that she was white like her father and not at all black like me, I went on a quest to unearth the history of my own interracial slave and master kin buried in that cemetery. I wanted my daughter to embrace all of her roots, but I hadn't fully done that myself. My daughter's multiracial heritage was the result of a loving union, but my great-grandmother Josephine's was begotten of rape at worst, sexual subjugation at best, illuminating a painful parallel to my story. I needed Sankofa, as the African proverb says, to go back and get my history. And then I called her the other day and did a little interview with her, and I took notes. And she ended the interview by saying, I've come to understand that it's necessary for me to allow myself to be a vessel for my ancestors' stories so that I can have dominion over my own body. The power of narrative, a taking back of the loss of dominion. She feels she's taking back the loss of dominion of her ancestors through expressing their stories, and in expressing their story, coming to better understand her own self. So to me, that is just right at the heart of I guess, really the whole topic of this talk, which is, narrative can play a really potent role in grappling with one's, history through generations. Now, I wanted to turn briefly to the theory around narrative and the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I think it's just sort of, it's illuminating. It can be illuminating for one's own journeys. And I'm not going to go through all of it because the woman, Lisa DeMay, in the dissertation mentions 9 or 10 key facets of how narrative plays a role. I'm just going to take up a few of them. One we've already talked about, in a way, the role of testimony and also the lack of testimony. And I gave you a quote from one of the Brazilian adult children of survivors who talked about the lack of testimony. But the impact of repetitive testimony can also weave into the self. And I want to give you 2 examples. One is where the testimony that the traumatized parent is telling the child can be presented in a hopeful light. And perhaps that can lead to all kinds of perhaps positive things, hope and resilience. And this was a quote from one of the subjects in the study. My mother would tell us stories of the war ever since I was a child. We'd hear those stories at bedtime. She didn't tell us fairy tales, but parts of her own story, which always had a message of hope. She managed to stay in this bubble, sort of like life is beautiful. But now testimony can also be presented in a scary, terrifying light, can perhaps lead to traumatic response in offspring. I have an example from my own family. My nephew, whose grandfather on the other side was a Holocaust survivor, and he used to tell him all sorts of stories. And I remember when he was 4 years old, my nephew said to me once, "Auntie, it's okay to lie, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, no, it isn't." He said, "Well, yes, my grandpa told me that if someone comes and asks you if you're a Jew, you have to lie. That's how he didn't get killed. Otherwise, they'll kill you." And I remember hearing this from a 4-year-old and thinking, wow, potent narrative there. Here's another quote from one of the Brazilian interviewees that I mentioned that study. And this is about the terrifying kind of narratives this person was told. We talked of the Nazis at home as we talked of the air we breathed. The stories were about the Nazis. There were few stories about what it was like at the village where my father was born or what it was like in the city. All the stories were about atrocities she'd witnessed, my mother. We didn't eat soup at home. We had blood instead. So I'm going to just skip this a little bit, one sec. Yeah, there's also the impact of no testimony. I just want to say one more point about that, is that often things that are heavily not talked about are still somehow, they're found in studies, manage to be transmitted to the descendants. And in the literature, in the research on these people, they talk about an absent presence, a past which the second or later generations never actually experienced, but which haunts them continuously. And I actually have a quote from a novella I wrote, which I've actually used the title Dark Urgings of the Blood for that novella. And in that, there is a character who was never told about her father's traumatic Holocaust past. And she describes, this character describes two types of ghosts which haunted the homes of her friends mostly, but also her own. In the homes of my friends, it was as if we were surrounded by two kinds of ghosts which could never be mentioned. The ghosts of too many relatives murdered long before their time, and the ghostly pasts of my friends' parents. These two were cloaked in silence. So I want to move on to, so that's the first point, is the impact of testimony or no testimony of absence. The second, there's another element of the inadequacy of language that is often talked about in this literature, that language cannot house the experience. So what do we do with that? What do we do when language fails us? One of the researchers, his name happens to be Cod, puts it this way: when Holocaust victims will not or cannot bear witness, the corollaries for the next generation may be even worse and more outspoken due to the obsession that arises with the black hole, the hidden horror in their family history. I'm just looking at the time, and I was going to read you another excerpt from a recent essay. I think I'm going to skip it though, because Kerry, I think we have about 10 more minutes for the talk, or maybe 8. I'm going to talk now about briefly another element of the theory that I think is really powerful: narrative and post-memory. Now, you may not have heard of that term, post-memory. It was coined by a Columbia University professor named Marianne Hirsch in the 90s. And this is her definition of it. Post-memory characterizes the experience of those who grow up dominated by narratives that preceded their birth, whose own belated stories are evacuated by the stories of the previous generation, shaped by traumatic events that can be neither understood nor comprehended. So these events happened in the past, but their effects continue into the present. And Dominic LeCapra, who I mentioned earlier, he defines post-memory as, quote, the acquired memory of those not directly experiencing an event such as the Holocaust or slavery. In other words, instead of their own memories, future generations have an acquired memory of that traumatic experience, acquired via their parents' stories and other testimonies, or through all kinds of documentation, often completed by their own imaginations. So supposedly the psychological theory here is that one is bequeathed stories, often carried through objects as well. We see this with people who have survived genocide and so on. There'll be one object that just carries tremendous amount of meaning for the family. And then one's own imagination and psyche comes in to complete the story. And there's a weird thing that can happen for some people, where in doing that imaginative completion, it almost comes to be experienced as one's own. So it's almost as if the memory, even though it wasn't yours, actually came from your own experience. So in narratives that take up this theme, apparently such as my own books, but other people's books as well, including Toni Morrison and many others who are writing in this way, there have been analyses done of the kinds of characteristics of post-memory in these narratives. And I'll read you the list. Unreliable narrator. Pretty much all my books have an unreliable narrator. Mediation, which is a narrative term meaning showing different versions of a story, like the famous Rashomon Japanese film. And I have that too. I've got books where I have different perspectives showing the same events. And ghosts. My stuff also has ghosts in it. Toni Morrison's stuff is full of ghosts too. And interesting about ghosts is that ghosts are there even if they're not. And so it's sort of, again, one doesn't do this deliberately, but ghosts come to you as a narrative device, I guess, because there's a way in which, the history is there, but it isn't. So the ghost is almost like a metaphoric stand-in for the trauma in the past generations that is as present as a ghost, but of course is intangible and ephemeral, and you can't put your finger on it. And Toni Morrison's Beloved also has this theme of quests, absent presence, and ghosts, which is very characteristic of this kind of work. So I'm going to move to my conclusion here. We don't have time to go through all the different elements of the narrative, but I think I've given you a sense of what this theory, the kind of thing this theory has to offer. So I'm going to end on a bit of a personal literary note. I'm currently writing a nonfiction book, which is kind of like, it's not really a memoir. I call it a memoir in pieces because it's really not about me so much as about the stories I've carried with me through my life, other people's stories as well as historical stories. And some of my characters are in fact writers that I've had a particularly close connection with. One of them is Joseph Roth, who died in 1938, who was a very assimilated Jew. Actually, he converted to Catholicism late in his life, but he was also really haunted by the historical past. And he ends up dying, having to do with Nazi Germany, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. But what I wanted to say about this memoir is coming to the end of writing the memoir allowed me to see just how powerfully narrative has been a shaping force in my own literary life, but also just my own sort of personal, I guess, psychological, emotional experience. And as I was coming to the end of writing this book, I came to some insight about the very first literary sentence I really wrote as an adult. When I got my idea for my first novel, it came to me in the form of a sentence. It was a visual image, and a single sentence sort of ran across my mind, almost like a ticker tape banner. And I had no idea what it meant. I just knew it was a powerful sentence for me. And I then spent many years, actually it took 7 or 8 or 9 years to write that first book, trying to figure out what the novel was that went with the sentence. And the sentence ended up being the very last sentence of the novel. So in a narrative sense, it was kind of interesting. The very last sentence came to me fully born, and then I had to spend many years digging out the novel that went with the sentence. And the image I had was of a sort of an elegant man who had an air of mystery about him. He was standing before a mantelpiece, and on the mantelpiece was an urn. And I'm going to actually, well, I'll just describe it. He's staring at the urn. He's trying to imagine what that urn is. He's in a rented room and has a picture of a sort of a Chinese design of a man carrying a yoke water on his shoulders. And he's afraid that maybe it's a funeral urn. He wants to open it and look in it. He imagines that there are ashes in the urn, but he's too scared to look at it. So I'm going to read you, I called the guy Oscar, and this is the line that was the first line that ended up becoming the last line of the novel. At times, gazing at the lovely, distant, peaceful scene, another world entirely, a forgotten era, I feel that I am somehow like that funereal porcelain, a vessel for the ashes of the dead. And I'm just going to read you the paragraph in my own memoir book that goes with that. He was everything and nothing like what he appeared. Are any of us? A riddle of identity and history, layer upon layer of secrecy and torment, of morally dubious deeds, and yet many deeds that were saintly. Suffering, innocence, culpability, guilt, all of it swirling now around the room. And me, the consciousness holding it all, the vessel for all these stories, like Oscar perhaps, like all artists, a mere mortal breaking under the weight of my duty, a calling I did not ask for, yet had no choice but to heed. Understanding the privilege and burden of being ultimately, along with everything else, a vessel for the ashes of the dead. So it sounds a bit portentous, but it's just sort of, I guess, in a way, reflecting on my own life in narrative and all the stories I've carried within, often traumatic stories of other people's lives, and trying to give voice to those and wondering if I had a right to give voice to them, and yet feeling like I had no choice but to, and sort of through all that, claiming my own story in a way, which is, again, I think, related to the sort of what happens when history bears down on one in a way that feels both a privilege and a burden, and how narrative can come to serve a person, at least if you're a writer, maybe even if you're not a writer, in grappling with that history, coming to terms with it, and sort of living your life through the lens of it. So I'm going to stop there, but before I do, I just want to throw out something. I know you may have your own questions, but I just want to throw out something maybe for you to consider yourselves in terms of the ways in which our own family's history and memories can impact us. And it might be interesting sometime to think about that in your own lives, to think about your own family history and stories that you may not realize really, might guide you in the decisions you make, or in the ways you choose to live your lives, and even in the very essence of your own self. So I'm going to stop there now and come back to you, Kerry.
Thank you very much. And yes, now we will turn to some questions from our audience. And you referenced the transgenerational transmission of trauma from slavery, from the Holocaust. I know you grew up in Australia. Would you comment a little bit on the lost generation?
Oh gosh, absolutely. The stolen generation.
Stolen generation, right.
Funnily enough, in my new book, I have a whole chapter called Moon Landing. It's going to be published in July, actually, in this magazine that is going to time it with the moon landing. And in that, I'm just going to tell you a little personal thing. That is a story about a childhood friend of mine who was an Aboriginal girl who lived in an orphanage. And none of us had any idea. I found out, and I write about this in the chapter, I found out that her mother was alive, and I couldn't understand why was she living in an orphanage. And I only realized as an adult that she must surely have been one of the stolen generations. Now, in Australia, and if people don't know about this awful, very recent history, Aboriginal children were taken from their homes from the 1800s up until, if you can believe this, 1974. Their culture was destroyed. They were truly abducted by the state. It was government approved, authorized. Policemen and priests would come to the home and take the children. And the idea was, let's place these children in orphanages or with white families. I mean, I can hardly talk about it. Australia has been trying to reckon with this, and there was an official apology made to the Aboriginal nations. We call the First Nations of Australia. It's a multitude of peoples, and a public apology was made. I don't have the date at my fingertips, but it was I think maybe the late 90s. Of course, does very little except begin the conversation. So all I have to say is that country is struggling, my former country is struggling with that legacy, and the narratives are being told. First of all, the story had to be told of the fact of what happened. It was all criminally suppressed. We learn nothing in school about any of this. That's the first step, is the narrative of what actually happened is being told. And members of the communities are reaching back to reclaim their histories as best they can.
Can you talk about your time in Colombia? Did you study the transgenerational transmission of trauma from the intense years of violence that plagued the country in the 80s and 90s?
There's a fantastic question. No, I didn't do that at all. When we were in Mexico, I did some thinking and writing about some of the parallels with the colonial trauma, the colonialization trauma in Mexico, just in my own fiction writing. In Colombia, I really did nothing professionally or in a literary way. I know a little bit about that history. We were just living there as a family because my husband had a job there. And our son, who is at Carleton, spent a year in school there, so that his Spanish has a Colombian accent these days, I believe. But I'm sorry, I can't really say anything of interest there.
Somewhat related to the stolen generation, how do you think the transgenerational transmission of trauma intersects with compulsory forced sterilization of people deemed unfit to produce children?
Gosh, that's a fascinating question. Well, I mean, the first thought that crosses my mind is if people are sterilized in that way, they're not going to be passing anything down. They're not going to be having children, right? So what you're doing there is you're slamming shut an entire narrative of a whole multi-generational trajectory that ends with that person. I'm wondering what the question asker is thinking about in particular of those. Is there a particular historical period or in the present, or I don't really know.
Okay, hopefully we'll get that. In the meantime, how did you use storytelling in psychotherapy?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think I worked for about 5 years in psychiatric hospitals, and actually one of the things that was so impactful to me was to realize that my role was very often the role of an advocate for people who've been hospitalized, who are living in a psychiatric hospital. And often I would find myself spinning a narrative about agency and about how I would try and encourage I call them my clients, they were called patients, but my clients to think about the role they played in their own treatment, and not to always, because sadly, sometimes in those situations, people are being, told what's best for them, their agency is being taken away. And I tried to train people to listen to whether they felt trusting or whether they felt safe. And if they didn't, to question some of the narratives that were coming at them by the doctors or by people who were, it is a very delicate it's a very unusual place to be. So I think I found, first of all, there's just helping a person reframe and reshape their own narrative to think that they can go back out into the world and have agency over their lives and live the kind of life that they want to live. That's the first obvious way in which narrative is critical. How can we develop a narrative about you and who you are in the world that will allow you to go out and live the kind of life you want to live? And second of all, how can we be sure that the narrative of you have agency in your life is carried with you, so you're not subject to other people imposing their will on you? Sorry, convoluted answer.
No, that's great. We're going to return to the previous question regarding forced sterilization. The member of our audience said, I was originally thinking of the popular period of eugenics in the United States and Europe directly leading up to the World War II, and of course during the Holocaust. My question was born out of curiosity about whether there can be transgenerational transmission within communities, even if individuals have had the right to have children forcibly revoked.
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Wow. Yeah, that unbelievable. And of course that happened in Nazi Germany as well. And there was the opposite too, by the way. And I actually have a story about that in Awake in the Dark, the opposite, whereby people were mated in order to create Aryan purity. And there were, people taken from villages and so on who satisfied, this was also a form of eugenics, who satisfied the Nazi notion of Aryan purity, and they were made to have sex and have children, and the children were then put into homes of Aryans. And so that definitely created all kinds of trauma in those people. And by the way, some of that, there have been interesting articles in the recent decade or so about those people having grown up and what their lives were like, knowing that they were really the victims of this kind of weird experiment in Aryan purity. But to go back to the actual question more directly, absolutely, I imagine that would have tremendous ramifications in all the ways that I tried to outline in that again, I'm a good example of not the eugenics, but of an example of someone who's carried these stories, even though the Holocaust was not in my direct parents and grandparents, right? It was on behalf of my community. And so clearly I've carried that in a way. I've spent my life writing about these subjects. And so I imagine that could be the case for someone who has that narrative passed on to them about their own family members or community to whom that happened. And I imagine it would play out in a similar way, where there'd be maybe feelings of absences, of a lack in the self, or of ghosts, or of a quest to try and find out what really happened. You know, those sorts of same things I imagine play out in the same way, similar way.
When traumatic memory is fragmented and quote unquote inaccurate, to what extent do you think we can trust it when we attempt to make modern day amends or reparations?
Well, that's the very vexed question of memory in general, right? If anyone studied any of the studies on judicial proceedings and memory and witness memory and so on, we know and there's an incredible film with Robin Williams called, I think it's called In the Cut or The Final Cut or something, which also explores memory in an extraordinary way, where it's a sci-fi kind of film where a chip is implanted in the brain and can record absolutely everything that happens in life. And when you go back, when a person dies and you can take the chip out and see every moment of their life, you see how different their actual memory was from what actually happened, because they, were able to do a sort of a cross-reference. So we know that memory is notoriously unreliable, but the way I think about it is that emotional memory and psychological trauma and suffering and so on, it has its own language and it's accurate in its way, right? I mean, it's accurate. I sort of believe in a kind of emotional truth, psychological truth, where the details don't always matter. And as a psychologist, you have to learn to sort of speak to the emotional truths. And again, the goal there is to help the person move out into the world and live the life they want to live, unimpeded or unburdened by the trauma as best as is possible. And in that case, the actual details don't fully matter. When it comes to reparations, that's a whole different question, right? Because reparations has such a legalistic element to it, the whole idea of reparations. And when it comes to that domain, facts supposedly, facts are front and center. But now we have this vexed question of don't always have full access to the facts. So what do we do with something like that? I guess your guesses are all as good as mine. And I've heard, actually, I was recently listening to various scholars talking about reparations regarding slavery in this country. And the arguments are extremely compelling on both sides. You've got very erudite people saying, yes, it really is possible, and other erudite people saying, no, it really isn't. And these are the questions they're having to debate, are these kinds of questions. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to sort of judgment and moral, framing the argument in perhaps moral ethical terms that will take these vagaries into consideration. And good luck to the people who have to do it, because I certainly wouldn't want to be one of them. Very complex.
What inspires you to write?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I've always felt that, and a lot of writers are like this, people I know, maybe not the comic writers, but the things that trouble me and sadden me about life and the world are always the things that have inspired me to write. In fact, I remember someone came to do an article when one of my books came out, and the interviewer met me and she said, "Oh, I'm so surprised. You seem like a sunny, sort of positive person, and you write such sad things, like I cried through, your whole book or something." And I think so it can be at odds with your personality, that the things that inspire a writer can be not necessarily the things that you would think inspire a writer. But for me, it's, I think, the things that make me grieve and that make me sad and that trouble me about the species that we are, the human species that can do the sorts of things that we do to each other. But at the same time, there's always beauty in the world and heroism and resilience. And I guess I'm inspired by stories of people who prevail under the most, extraordinarily different circumstances and manage to go on and live fruitfully. So I think those are the things that draw my attention.
Related question, what is the best thing about being a writer?
I can very easily talk about the worst things. Let's see, the best thing, I guess, is, and people who are writers maybe, or any sorts of artists, or anyone who loves anything could maybe relate. I think just the feeling of when you're really in the flow of it, you, as a writer, you can feel very alive and connected and at one with the universe and yourself. And you can also sort of feel like quite powerful, like this sort of godlike feeling of, you know, I'm making all this happen. I'm creating a world in words that didn't exist before. And that can be tremendously satisfying. Like, I've never gone back really to read my stuff, but on occasion when I've had to like read a quote or something, I think, wow, did I actually write that? Because it feels like something that someone else wrote that is like satisfying, because I relate to it so much. And sometimes I'll read it and I'll think, wow, I can really relate to that. And I remember, well, I actually wrote it, so I hope that I should be able to relate to it. So just, I guess, that sense of connection and creative aliveness.
You read from Awake in the Dark. What was the Toni Morrison book that you read from?
Oh, that was Beloved.
Beloved. Okay. And in your books, there are certain obvious similarities. What are some differences in your various books?
Oh, okay. So my second book is called The Listener. And I really love that book because that book is set in a psychiatric hospital. And I actually used one of the psychiatric hospitals I worked in for 2 years as the prototype. It's a very gothic, sort of mysterious place. And when I first went to work there, the minute I set foot on this, it was an old-fashioned institution with massive, beautiful buildings and gorgeous landscape gardens, acre, 150 acres or something. And I said to myself, I'm going to write a book set here. And I did. And that book was about a soldier who had post-traumatic stress. And it was set in 1951. So he'd been in World War II. And one of the other main characters was the head of the psychiatric hospital, who had himself been a medic in World War I. And one of the nurses there had been a prisoner in Bataan during World War II, captured by the Japanese. These were all based on true stories. I did a ton of research. In fact, here's a very satisfying thing about being a writer. One of the nurses who had written a book about her experience read my book and wrote to me. It was amazing because I used her book for my research for my book. And then she wrote to me, most beautiful, she must have been in her 90s or something at the time. And she wrote and said, you really captured the experience so well. And it made me, and I was so relieved and happy that she felt that way. But anyway, so that was really about, not about the Jewish experience so much as about like the impact of war on everybody that it touches, and how all of those characters were equally distressed, and one happened to be a patient and the other two were staff, but everybody was, it's the human condition of who's crazy and who's not. I'm watching the time, I'll just say one last thing, like the idea to me that it's sane to send people to war to kill each other, but then if you have a psychotic reaction to that, you're crazy. That fascinated me. Like, how do we define what's sane and what's crazy? And the patient who's supposedly crazy sort of says, well, isn't it crazy that you're trying to get me psychologically better so I can go back and fight? Anyway, that's a book that's quite a bit different.
Fascinating. This has been extremely fascinating, Dr. Nayman. Could I ask you for a closing comment before we leave today?
Well, I don't really have a closing comment beyond, I think, what I've already said, except I would just say to all of you, as you're at college, you're at a very formative stage of your life. Or I would actually say this, we've all lived the last year through a very complex time. I'm sure there is some element of trauma associated for lots of people having to do with the pandemic. And maybe to think about ways in which narrative could play a role for you personally in sort of making sense of what you've been through the last year, and in carrying through your own story now, despite or in the face of these tremendous disruptions and change in your whole narrative sense of how your life is going to play out. This has been somewhat disrupted, obviously, over the last year. So it just might be useful to think about ways in which thinking through your own narrative might be helpful to you in terms of living out of this period, hopefully into the next post-pandemic period.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Nayman, and thank you all for joining us today. Our guest next week will be Bas Dressinger. founder of the Prison to College Pipeline Program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
That sounds
And
fascinating.
until then, I encourage you all to be well and be kind. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.